Do you worry at all about the what's going on in Europe in the Eurozone, and they've come up with a plan, but they really need to find a way to finance the plan? And I guess my question is, do you worry that somehow they're going to fall into the arms of Russia or China?
I don't know that they'll fall. I don't know that Russia or China would want them to fall into their arms. You know, what's falling in is basically a bunch of bankrupt governments. And, but I'm worried about it because we have close relationships. Well, A, we have political, geostrategic relationships with Europe. But B, we have huge economic entanglements, obviously, and financial entanglements. And I don't think the current deals they keep cutting just strike me as not being sustainable. I mean, I'm not an economics expert or something like international monetary economics, which is pretty complicated, but you know, basically they just can't afford the governments they're running, and you know, the governments can back up the banks can then lend the money back to the government. But at some point, that cycle has to, you know, the musical chairs, someone blows the whistle, and the musical chair stops, and everyone notices there's not enough money. And that's what's happened in Greece. And incidentally, if Greece needs to take a 50% haircut, Greece is not totally different from Italy or Spain. They're not even totally different from other nations in Europe, not totally different from us. I mean, if Greece's bonds are really only worth 50 cents on the dollar, what do we think the Italian bonds are really worth? What do we think the French bonds, what do we think our bonds are really worth? I mean, it's a scary prospect, and one really worries, I do, about a major, you know, that we haven't seen the end of the '08 financial crisis. I guess that's my basic view. That unfortunately, Obama has done very little to resolve the fundamentals. He moved a lot of debt off the bank's balance sheets onto the government's balance sheet. So now we have more public sector debt, a little less private sector debt, but it's still debt. And it's got to be paid off some way or inflated away some way, and which is a way of, you know, paying it off, of depreciating it. And so I think the economic situation remains very worrisome. I don't know whether, you know, 2 months from now something bad will happen, or we'll stagger along for a year with slow growth, but it is worrisome. And I think the strategic implications are more just that Europe is not going to be a very strong player with us in the world, which is unfortunate. I mean, we were much stronger when we had stronger NATO allies. The Europeans hated us over there a couple months ago. When you tell them you guys are too weak, you know, they think they're being insulted. But I'm not. One doesn't say that to them out of joy. One says it out of sorrow. I mean, Libya is the most they could do, which was good. But we did a lot more than we seemed to do, I'd say, on that, even though we were leading from behind. And the attitude I was written about Libya now is we could never do that again. That was exhausting. That took everything we had. They literally can't do some of it again because they're downsizing their armed forces so much. And so you say to them, well, maybe you could try to help in Syria, and we could get rid of Assad, which would be a huge strategic victory against Iran, and they just look at you like, you know, Libya was already exhausting and we can't do much more. So that's bad for us from a strategic point of view. There's just one more. Yes.
For most of us conservatives, the major media is just hopeless. Would you say that phenomenon is getting worse, getting better?
I don't know. I've always been a little less convinced. I mean, I don't like the mainstream media, but I've always been a little less convinced that it was a huge problem for conservatives than some of my fellow conservatives, only in this very simple-minded sense that nothing could have been worse than the dominance the media had in 1980. There was no cable news, there was no Rush Limbaugh, there was no Fox, obviously. I mean, there was just the New York Times, and there was no USA Today. The New York Times, the Journal had very little, you know, non-financial news. And then there were the 3 networks, all of them were located, you know, a mile from the New York Times offices, and basically reproduced the New York Times on the evening news. And that was it. And people forget how little choice one had in the old days. And even so, the voters were able to see through the media fog and elect Reagan, and re-elect Reagan, and elect Giuliani in '93. So in some ways, I think the situation is better. I mean, the media itself is less professional. In the old days, the Times, the Post, even the TV networks had a mix of old-fashioned, straightforward reporting, shoe-leather reporting, and liberal bias. And some of the liberal bias was unconscious, it just was cultural, it's where the people, you know, lived, it's what they kind of assumed. But there was actually still a tradition of old-fashioned reporting. I think that tradition, unfortunately, is fading. And now we just have sort of the liberal bias left. The good news is they're much less powerful than they once were. When I got to Washington in '85, when I got to the White House in '89, I was Dan Quayle's chief of staff. The 3 evening news networks, evening news shows, 6:30 p.m., 7 p.m., whatever they were on, what was it, that Brokaw, Rather, and Jennings, I guess, had, I think, 88% of TVs that were on at that time were on one of those 3 were watching one of those 3 shows. There was no cable to speak of. There were 5 or 6 stations, and half of them were showing these news, and that's how you got your news. There was no talk radio. You know, there was no internet, obviously. No Fox News, no cable news. CNN was a little boutique thing in the late 80s. And so, you know, I remember sitting in the White House, you'd watch the news at 6:30. If you got a bad story on both Rather and Brokaw or something, you were in deep trouble. You had to spend the next 12 hours figuring out how to get out from under this, what to do tomorrow, to fix the story today. It's really much healthier today. The 3 evening news shows together now have about 1/3 of the viewership at that time. You all know this, just you go to your TV, there are 500 channels, right? And plus you already know the news. You've gone online, you've heard stuff during the day, you've turned on cable, you don't need to watch the news at 6:30 to be told what happened. So the power of the big actors, the big players in the mainstream media is radically diminished. Now they can still cause a lot of trouble, they can still drive the story. The left has been affected on the internet, but so is the right. And I do think, I'm struck when I go to colleges, the degree to which kids these days can correct the bias. It's unfortunate that the colleges and universities are in such bad shape and so full of political correctness and liberal bias. On the other hand, unlike when I was in school, they can go places and get the opposite point of view. You know, just click on Real Clear Politics in the morning and read Charles Krauthammer's column. You don't have to be in Washington reading the Washington Post. I tell this to college students in the old days, unless the particular paper of your hometown subscribed to George Will or Charles Krauthammer, and some of them did, you couldn't just read Charles Krauthammer's column from this morning, you know, there was no internet to click on. Maybe if you were lucky, 3 days later it would get reproduced somewhere or someone would send it to you. So the degree to which people can correct errors in the media, people can find alternate points of view, and we find this of course with the Standard as well, I mean it's a very good thing I think. And I think it's made it a more wide open playing field. It's a little chaotic and crazy. Stupid stories and false stories can get a little bit more legs because of the internet, but they tend to get corrected pretty quickly. So I'm basically a fan of the modern media compared to and the modern media situation, even despite all the distractions of cable news, all the silliness, all the craziness of the internet. It's healthier than when there was this kind of monopoly of the big 3 networks and the New York Times. And I think that's another way, in this case, technology has helped conservatives get more of an even playing field for their ideas. Let me stop. Thank you very much.